From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
With Congressman David Cicilline leading primary challenger Anthony Gemma by just 4 points in our exclusive Eyewitness News poll, the race is competitive and each candidate is carving out their playbook.
If I'm Anthony Gemma, I'm going to be talking about the City of Providence finances.
Because I do believe as the City of Providence goes, so does the state of Rhode Island goes.
I'm going to talk about David Cicilline not being honest.
What I called and I dubbed, and they are, lies.
I'm going to talk about the character issues.
My character, is just like Mr. Doherty. We have impeccable character.
If I'm David Cicilline, I want to still hit my positives, talk about the jobs and the economy.
The middle class of our country, the middle class of Rhode Island, to get people back to work.
But also, I need to define Anthony Gemma. If I cannot bring my positive numbers up, I need to bring Anthony Gemma's positive numbers down.
He's anti-choice. He supported the policies of Governor Kucheri.
This week on Newsmakers, the race for Congress in Rhode Island's 1st Congressional District and national politics with Eyewitness News political analyst and pollster Joe Fleming and special guest, senior editor for the Cook Political Report in Washington, D.C., Jennifer Duffy. Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel is WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and political reporter for Rhode Island Public Radio, Ian Donis. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, Joe and Jennifer. Thank you very much for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.
For political watchers, you need no introduction, but so everyone can get an idea here. As senior editor with Cook, you focus primarily on presidential, Senate, and gubernatorial races. The Cook Political Report is a highly respected, independent, authoritative newsletter in politics. You've appeared on every major network at one time or another as an analyst, and the most important part of your resume, you're from Rhode Island.
Exactly.
So let's take a look, Nick, if you could bring up our first poll number so we can start the conversation with that. We polled in the 1st Congressional District 302 likely primary voters. You see here that incumbent Congressman David Cicilline got 40%. Anthony Gemma, the Democratic challenger, 36%. 20% aren't sure. This poll comes with a margin of error of 5.7%, and it was performed by Fleming and Associates, who's joining us at the table. Jennifer, I realize the House races aren't your specialty, but
except this one.
All right, good. So indulge us then. Cicilline is leading by 4 points in the primary race. Our poll in February that Joe did shows that he was trailing the Republican challenger by 15 points from the seats in Washington, D.C. What is your take on all of this?
I mean, it's fascinating that this is a race that we've already put in our toss-up column. We tend not to put incumbents in the direction of the other party. They sometimes tend to have second lives or third lives. But I think of all the incumbents that we see that have not been hurt by redistricting, that he is probably the most vulnerable Democrat on the ballot.
And of 435 House seats.
Right, but the Democratic incumbent that didn't get put into a primary with another sitting member whose district wasn't radically altered by redistricting. It's really pretty remarkable that in a Democratic primary you have Cicilline sitting at 40% and only, leading somebody who voters don't even know by 4 points.
Joe, in an interview this week, I noticed Anthony Gemma is going to the kinder, gentler side of things, and I asked him if it was a mistake not to highlight what's happening in Providence, and he said to me, quote, this current election you're going to find David Cicilline has apologized for those lies, and I think the voters now know. So I don't believe there is anything to talk about anymore there, and I want the voters to get to know me and how passionate I am. Right or wrong path to victory?
Well, it's wrong. Even when he announced, he started talking about Brendan Doherty and ignored David Cicilline. He has to really focus on David Cicilline for the primary, and he has to talk about the City of Providence. That's the only reason David Cicilline has such low numbers. It's nothing he's done in Congress. It all goes back to the City of Providence. If he doesn't talk about the City of Providence, the Cicilline camp is going to be thrilled because it's going to take it out of the headlines, at least through the primary for them. Big mistake on Gemma's part.
Joe, Cicilline is obviously a skilled campaigner, a dogged debater, a good fundraiser. He'll have the full support of the Democratic establishment. How does Anthony Gemma compete against those institutional advantages? Can he really overcome that?
Well, it's going to be difficult for Anthony, a Democratic primary, because Democratic primaries around, especially the 1st Congressional District, tend to be more liberal, and the unions do a very good job, and they're supporting Cicilline to get their vote out. And right now, Cicilline is leading among the union members only by 5%. However, 25% are undecided. So I think it's going to help him as far as Cicilline with the union vote. So Anthony Gemma is going to have a lot to overcome. However, what we found in our survey was about 32% of the voters who don't know who Anthony Gemma is voting for him. So it's anyone but David Cicilline with some voters.
Jennifer, in the show before coming on this program, we were exchanging some emails, and you said, without even seeing the numbers because we hadn't released them yet, you said, look at the crosstab on labors, that's going to tell the story.
And I think it does tell the story, because in the poll that you did earlier this year, I was stunned at how Cicilline was doing among union households, that his number was much lower than it ought to be. It was better among Democratic primary voters. And Joe is right, the union is very good at getting their members out there, but you have to understand that everything that's gone on in Providence has really impacted labor. And they're sort of bearing the brunt of this, and who are they going to blame? They're going to blame David Cicilline.
Jen, let me stick with you. We were all on a bunch of radio shows talking about the poll this week, and one thing that kept coming up was this sense that's out there that David Cicilline is a dead man walking, and he's not going to win. And I know pretty much at this table that's not the feeling. He's a fighter. And what's the path to victory for David Cicilline from the primary and then the general?
Well, the path to victory in the primary is to pin Gemma down, to define Gemma before Gemma can define himself, especially if Gemma is true to his word and he's not going to bring up a lot of Cicilline's vulnerabilities. You know, the problem with that, though, for him is that by the time he gets to the general, he's left a lot for Republicans to work with. If Gemma's not going to litigate Providence finances in the primary, they will be litigated in the general election, and that is Republicans' biggest hope. I mean, if you asked any Republican strategist, they'll tell you that they would much prefer to run against David Cicilline in the fall.
Jennifer, there's a whole genre of political office holders who've suffered a lack of trust or credibility among voters, apologized, and tried to fight their way back. How do you see Cicilline comparing with those other people in the past nationally who've failed or succeeded in coming back from that kind of challenge?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. If you look at this poll, it struck me that voters didn't really believe the apology. They didn't accept the apology. It's almost that they thought that it was done for a political purpose, as opposed to sort of a from-the-heart, sincere problem. I mean, if you looked at another poll we saw this week, the CBS New York Times poll, you know, 2/3 of voters felt that the president's announcement on same-sex marriage was politically motivated. I think voters have gotten very cynical about this. So apologies, you know, this wasn't about personal behavior. This was about the way he governed. And how
it's more damaging in many ways.
Well, it is more. That's my point. People cannot write it off to a personal misjudgment. I mean, this was a big deal, and it impacts voters more closely. So it doesn't surprise me that voters did not really embrace the apology.
But go ahead.
I was going to say, I think if you did this 16 months ago, it would have had a bigger impact for him.
Yeah, the cake is already made.
Now it does look very political.
But would it have been, Joe, worse had he not come out and apologized for saying the conditions in Providence in 2010 were
I think this stops the bleeding for him, at least. It may not help him, but I think it stops his downfall. People now are at least saying, well, he admitted he was wrong in 2010. Up to this point, people kept saying, why don't you tell the truth? Tell us what happened in 2010. Now at least he's done that. He apologized on camera. And I think it stops the bleeding. Now, it's still going to be an issue. There's no question. Whether Anthony Gemma brings it up, and I'm sure the Doherty people hope he doesn't so they can use it more, it will be brought up in November, no question.
Jen, it's one thing though I have noticed at the same time is, and frankly partly because of the interview we did at this table with Brendan Doherty, people are starting to wonder, is he prepared to run a tough race in November against a very savvy incumbent, David Cicilline, in a Democratic district where you're going to have to thread the needle on how to stay moderate enough that the Democrats feel okay voting for you. I mean, what do you think about that? Is Doherty prepared?
You know, he is a first-time candidate. I love listening to candidates who get into this and about 90 days later say, you know, this is a lot harder than it looks. And I think that Doherty is suffering from some of that. No, I mean, look, you know, he's got to work on federal issues. He's got to get them down. He's got to be ready to answer questions from people like us. And I'm sort of hoping that interview, which was not a high point in the campaign, was a wake-up call for them, or at least the staff.
Joe, do you think it's easier, to steal Ted's phrase, for Brendan Doherty to thread the needle because he doesn't have a primary and he's not going to be forced, say, to the right to try and lure those voters?
I think that helps him greatly. I think if he had the primary, he'd probably push more to the right for the Republican Party in Rhode Island. He needs to stay right down the middle of the road in the 1st Congressional District. It's a more moderate to liberal district. I know he has some Democratic support up in the northern part of the state. He has to really capitalize on that and really use those voters. If he does his campaign right down the middle, I think he's going to be very well defined. However, he has to really work on the senior citizen issue and insulate himself on that issue before David Cicilline or Anthony Gemma goes after him, saying he's going to hurt Social Security. That could hurt him in the 1st Congressional District.
What's astonishing to me, too, in this poll is you have Cicilline, as you said, at 40% in a Democratic primary against basically an unknown in a lot of ways. Rhode Island has no lack of ambitious Democrats. Why has no normal politician, and I don't mean that against Anthony Gemma, but just someone who's come up the normal way, jumped into this race? And how has Cicilline managed that?
You know, I think that people like Cicilline, who are vulnerable, who know they're vulnerable, they spend a lot of time, you know, keeping other people out of the race. I know he got the Democratic leadership in Congress behind him. They weren't going to go out and recruit anybody. I mean, the problem is, okay, get in this. Where does the money come from? And what kind of support do I get? And I think
you're saying if you're someone else.
If you're a candidate, you know, the questions you have to ask is, you know, where's my sort of infrastructure going to come from? If everybody's behind Cicilline, where's the money going to come from? If most of the donors are sort of in Cicilline's camp, it just didn't seem like a good bet to anybody. And I think a lot of people were waiting to see if Cicilline would really run. And when it became apparent that he was going to run, you know, they decided that this wasn't their race.
We see how the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is already running TV commercials supporting Doherty. The Supreme Court has freed the ability of business groups and labor unions to run these kind of independent ads. Will this more advantage one candidate than another, or is this essentially a wash as the race heats up?
Well, I mean, it's not just the ads themselves, but the timing. And I think that the timing of the Chamber's ads and the tone of the Chamber's ads are actually pretty good for Doherty. He's not well known in the district yet. This saves him a lot of money by not having to get in the fight early with his own TV. I actually think it's a plus for him. Well, let's see what happens in the fall when you have a general election, because then you have some of the other big super PACs come in, like American Crossroads, for example, or Americans for Prosperity.
Which are also Republican groups.
Yes, these are Republican super PACs. And who comes to Cicilline's defense? My guess is Labor. Democrats have had a much harder time raising money for their own party super PACs. There's something called the House Majority Fund. That's going to, you know, they're going to be out there trying to do some advertising, but it's unclear whether they're going to have enough money to really target more than a handful of districts.
What is the price tag on this race, not for super PACs, but for the candidates we're talking about here?
You know, you should be able to do this for $2 million. I mean, primary, general.
Each?
Yeah.
Wow.
That would be a pricey one. Here, what do you think on the...
But it should be a pricey one. This is a competitive race. This is, you know, how expensive competitive races are. Remember that in the fall, you've got a lot of competition for voters' attention on TV, because you're going to get some of the blowback from the Senate race in Massachusetts.
Joe Kennedy as well.
Joe Kennedy's House race. So, you know, that gets more expensive, and you have to put more ads up to sort of get the same value. To get, you know, you're going to have voters see your ads more than they would if it was the only game in town.
Joe, what do you think on the primary? About $500,000 to get through this one?
I think it's going to be at least $500,000 for the primary for each of the candidates. Again, because it's so tight at this point.
But as Jennifer points out, as you get closer to the general election, the price tag goes up because it's at a premium, you know?
And the advantage Doherty has, as Jen just pointed out, with the chamber doing these ads, they're now starting to define Brendan Doherty in a very positive light, the state trooper, person concerned about jobs, and neither David Cicilline or Anthony Gemmer can go after him at this point because they're just fighting for their own survival.
Jennifer, how do polls like this, if at all, affect the candidate's ability to snag money from Washington, D.C.?
Well, I think that it makes it a little bit harder, but of course, you know, the Cicilline campaign, I'm sure, is saying to donors outside of Rhode Island, I'm in big trouble, and I really need your help. So I think that I don't think it's going to impact him negatively one way or the other.
But for Brendan Doherty?
This should actually, it's polls like this that actually help Brendan Doherty, because the one thing outside Rhode Island, it's very hard to convince a lot of donors in Washington that Rhode Island 1 is a competitive race for a Republican. And
you must be getting a lot of calls.
Yeah. Is this true? Yeah, it's true.
But suddenly it's a very important race, Rhode Island 1.
It is a very important race. I mean, you have, you know, Democrats trying to get the House majority back. They need about 25 seats to do that, and boy, what they don't need is to have to fight a race in the 1st District of Rhode Island.
Joe, just remember, the last time we had a really divisive Democratic primary in the CD1, we ended up with a Republican congressman, Ron Makeley. When Freddie St. Germain went up against Scott Wolf and barely won that primary, that set it up for the Republican to win in CD1.
We love your historic perspective here, Joe Fleming. We're going to, speaking of ads, we're going to take a break here on Newsmakers. When we come back, we're going to continue our political conversation. We're going to turn it to the national stage. Jennifer Duffy is going to stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right, Ted Nesi and Ian Donis. Our guest for this second half of Newsmakers is Jennifer Duffy. She's senior editor for Cook Political Report, Washington, D.C. I want to get out of Rhode Island for a moment here and talk about Indiana Senator Richard Lugar's primary loss to very conservative treasurer down there, Richard Murdoch. Names that don't mean much in Rhode Island, maybe, but when you consider the Lugar loss, and then Republican Maine Senator Olympia Snow stepping down and lashing out at the climate in D.C. What does this all say to you about Congress now and in 2013?
You know, this Congress is, you know, it gets more and more partisan every year, and somebody like Olympia Snow, who's always a swing vote on every issue, Lugar, who is a statesman in every way. I mean, he is one of the experts on foreign policy. He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on nuclear proliferation, and yet, you know, there's almost no space for members like that who want to compromise and want to solve problems. I mean, this guy Richard Murdoch, who beat Lugar in a primary 2 weeks ago, you know, he said that he believes that it's not partisan enough, that he wants to see a much more partisan Senate, and his version of compromise is that Democrats agree with him.
Well, I don't see Sheldon Whitehouse going for that.
No.
We should point out that Indiana is not always a friendly territory for Democrats in the Senate race, correct? But you still have it leaning Republican right now?
I do have it leaning Republican. It's one of these states that President Obama carried in 2008. He is not likely to carry it again. There's also a governor's race on the ballot there. It's an open governor's race. Mitch Daniels is term limited. So you've got a lot going on. You know, Murdoch actually got a good Democratic opponent, a congressman named Joe Donnelly. You know, he's going to have to defend some unpopular votes, health care reform, stimulus, TARP. But, you know, I think he'll run a good campaign, and his manager is a Rhode Islander.
That's right.
Back to the original
Paul Tencher.
That's
Back
right.
to the original question, though, I guess, is are moderates dinosaurs on both sides?
On both sides. I mean, what a lot of people miss is that there are enough moderates retiring on the Democratic side as well. People like Kent Conrad, North Dakota, Ben Nelson in Nebraska. So yeah, on both sides of the aisle, it's the center almost is non-existent.
Jennifer, to come back to Rhode Island for a minute, the news here has been dominated this week by the problems of 38 studios. I have to get your reaction to that and the question of why Rhode Island for decades seems to move past its fundamental economic problems.
Maybe investing so much money in things like 38 studios doesn't help. You know, it's like a lot of states that hasn't figured out yet how to move beyond its former economic base of manufacturing. I mean, it's been decades now. Some states have sort of found other ways to move around it. Rhode Island hasn't. Part of it is that Rhode Island doesn't have the most friendly business climate. It's a hard place to come and expand and start a business, and then they make mistakes, like their investment.
Yeah, it's looking that way this week, that's for sure. I want to ask also in Rhode Island, as Tim said, you cover Senate races. This week, Nate Silver, who writes the 538 numbers blog for the New York Times, very good election data cruncher, he put Sheldon Whitehouse's odds of winning re-election at 99%. What's your take on that race right now? Would you go that far?
Does he have a margin of error on that?
I didn't check. Good point. Yeah.
No.
So he could win 102%.
Right. I mean, Nate Silver's very good at what he does. But look, I think that Barry Hinckley's a nice guy. He's another one who's learning that being a candidate is actually really hard work, especially the fundraising part of it. Look, Sheldon Whitehouse doesn't have the kind of problems David Cicilline has. He's focused on a lot of the right issues, especially some consumer protection stuff, very focused on the middle class. Voters aren't that upset with him. If they are upset, it has to do probably with what little Congress gets done, but I don't think we can put the blame for that squarely in Sheldon Whitehouse's lap. This is a really tough race for Barry Hinckley. 99%, I get where Nate Silver comes up with that number. I think that this is not a race that either party is focused on. I know what Republicans have told Barry Hinckley was raise the money, increase your name ID, make this a close race, and then come back and talk to us.
And then we'll talk, right. Well, your stock on talking about the Senate races has gone up because, there are 33 Senate races, right?
Right.
And I think Cook has 10 of them as a toss-up, if I looked at it correctly here.
That's about right.
What are the chances of the Republicans taking over the Democratic-controlled Senate?
You know what? Right now today, they're 50-50. It is a complete jump ball. And the most interesting thing about this is the Senate could be decided by one of two things. Who wins the presidential race, which is going to be close since the vice president breaks ties, or what a candidate in the Senate race in Maine does.
Yeah, right. So he's an independent, we should point out, and he hasn't said where he's going to caucus.
That's right. Angus King, he was an independent governor, and he's running as an independent.
And a much more popular one than Lincoln Chafee.
Yes. I think the last time I looked, the governor, Chafee, was the most unpopular governor in the country.
Wow.
Yeah, that's not an easy thing to do. But the point is that what King is saying is that he's running because he's sort of sick of the partisanship and Congress not getting anything done, and but he's not going to play after the election, which he is likely to win. He will announce which party he's going to caucus with. So he may be, for a couple of weeks, the most powerful man in the country.
Right. So how unusual is that for someone to not announce where they're going to caucus?
We've never seen it.
So unusual then.
But you think he can get away with it through November?
He is getting away with it. And one of the reasons is voters in Maine really hold both parties in complete disdain.
And Olympia Snowe kind of gave him a reason to believe this, right?
Oh, exactly. I mean, he said that if she hadn't, retired, he had no desire to sit in the Senate, but for the reason she retired, he would like to go down to Washington and shake things up.
Is power sharing a possibility then?
I think power sharing is a possibility.
When is that?
Wow.
I mean,
there's power sharing will be in the eyes of the beholder. I can't imagine you'd have co-committee chairmen.
Yeah.
That wouldn't work. But you could have committees evenly divided, which would be pretty interesting. But the bottom line here is, whoever has control of the Senate in November, it's going to be by 1 or 2 seats.
The Washington Post, one of their blogs, did an analysis this week of the Electoral College, and they gave President Obama an advantage over Mitt Romney because they said the states in Obama's column, along with those that lean Obama, are equal more electoral votes than those for Romney. Do you agree?
We look at the Electoral College. We have very few states in play. I think we have 7 or 8, with 4 or 5 more that could come into play. But we still see a very close race. I mean, you can get to 270 electoral votes, which is what you need to win, any number of ways. The Post looks at it one way. We sort of tend to look at it straight up and down. And honestly, I'm not sure that these charts mean all that much into Labor Day.
Yeah. Jennifer, though we'd love to have you up here just to do Newsmakers, you're here for another reason, which is last night you got an honorary degree at Rhode Island College at the advanced degree commencement. What was that like, and what did you tell the graduates?
Within 30 seconds, by the way.
30 seconds, scariest thing I've ever done, and I actually talked a lot about civility and the need for more civility in American politics, and asked them to do what they could to let other people have their say, and to agree to disagree.
So you weren't with Murdoch and telling them more partisanship is what we need today in America?
No, that's not what I told them. No, we talked about how you treat somebody else's opinion.
I'm rather shocked you didn't say Newsmakers. This is the scariest thing you have ever done.
You promised to make me cry, and you haven't succeeded yet.
I know, we didn't pull our Oprah moves on you.
Right. Well, we have 20 seconds left. So, Jennifer, Duffy from the Cook Political Report, thank you for joining us this week.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to thank Joe Fleming, who was our first half guest. By the way, if you missed any of our poll coverage, you can catch it on our website, WPRI.com. You can get down and dirty with the crosstabs there. We break it down for you right online. For Ted Nesi, for Ian Donis, I'm Tim White, and we'll see you next week on Newsmakers.
Do you see any